3 a.m. Richard Sterling jolted awake, screaming a name he didn't recognize. Isabella. The sweat soaked his $600 silk sheets. His heart pounded as if he'd run a marathon, and in his mind, an unexplainable image. A woman falling from a stone tower, her white dress stained crimson, and the scream that still echoed in his ears. In the staff quarters 2 floors below, Valerie Sutton also woke up at that precise moment. She whispered a name she'd never heard before. Rashid. Her 4-year-old son, Luke, slept beside her in the narrow bed. She stared at the ceiling, trembling, unable to understand why she felt like she had lost something. Someone. A long, long time ago. Neither of them knew their souls had just recognized each other, after 1,000 years. If you've ever hated someone without knowing why, this story will change how you see hate forever. Richard Sterling was one of the wealthiest men in New York City. His real estate empire was worth $2.3 billion. He was 42 years old. He owned a penthouse that spanned the entire 47th floor of the city's most expensive skyscraper, and he had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in business. He also possessed something no one could explain: a visceral, irrational, uncontrollable hatred for his housekeeper. Valerie Sutton had been hired 6 months earlier by the most exclusive agency in the city. She had impeccable references, 8 years of experience working for elite families. Never a problem, never a complaint, never an object out of place. And yet from the first day Richard saw her, he felt something he had never felt for anyone. He hated her. He couldn't explain why. There was no logical reason. She did her job perfectly. She was quiet, efficient, invisible, as a good housekeeper should be. But every time he saw her, something inside him twisted. A blind rage that rose from his stomach to his throat, an impulse to scream at her, to fire her, to never see her face again. And most disturbing of all, he dreamed of her every night. These weren't normal dreams. They were vivid, cinematic, filled with details he couldn't have possibly invented. Stone castles, torches, armor, and always, always, her. In the dreams, he loved her, with an intensity that left him breathless upon waking. He held her, kissed her, swore he'd never leave her, and she cried, told him it was impossible, that their worlds were too different, that they'd be killed, and then death. Sometimes he was executed. Sometimes she fell from a tower. Sometimes they both died together, pierced by swords, their hands intertwined even in the end. Richard woke up from those dreams more than 100 times in 6 months, and every morning when he saw Valerie serving breakfast, he felt the same inexplicable hate. She no longer looked him in the eye. She'd learned not to. In the first few weeks, Valerie tried to be friendly. She smiled when she saw him, asked if he needed anything, offered to make his coffee the way he liked it. Each attempt was met with glacial coldness. Don't speak to me unless I ask you something. Limit your presence to what's strictly necessary. If I could, I would fire you today. She endured it because she needed the job. Luke had health problems, the treatments were expensive, and the salary Richard paid was 3 times the market rate. So she lowered her gaze, kept silent, and learned to be invisible. But there was something she couldn't explain either, despite the hatred he showed her. Valerie felt something completely different. Attraction. Not the normal attraction a woman might feel for a handsome, wealthy man. It was something deeper, older. As if her body remembered something her mind had forgotten. Every time she passed near him, her skin crawled. When their hands accidentally brushed while handing him something, she felt an electric shock that left her trembling. And at night, she dreamed too, of a man who looked like Richard, but dressed differently, with a beard, with eyes full of love instead of hate, and always and saying the same words before dying. I will find you in every life, even if you hate me first. My soul will recognize you. Valerie woke up from those dreams crying, without knowing why. It was in the 4th month that the first incident occurred that neither could ignore. Richard was in his penthouse office reviewing contracts. Valerie entered to leave a cup of coffee. He didn't look at her, as always. She placed the cup silently, as always. But as she turned to leave, something fell from her wrist. A cheap bracelet Luke had given her. She bent to pick it up. And at that moment, the sleeve of her uniform rode up, revealing the inside of her left wrist. Richard glanced up, by chance, and froze. On Valerie's wrist was a birthmark. It was shaped like a crescent moon. It was small, the size of a coin, a color somewhere between reddish and brown, and Richard knew it. He knew it because he had exactly the same mark, in the same place, the same size, the same shape. His hand moved by instinct. He grabbed Valerie's wrist tightly, turning it to get a better look. She let out a gasp of surprise. Richard looked at the mark. Then he looked at his own. Then he looked back at hers. Identical. As if they'd been made with the same mold. "What the hell is this?" he whispered, more to himself than to her. Valerie didn't understand what was happening. She only felt his firm grip on her wrist, the proximity of their bodies, and something else. Something that made her feel, for the first time in months, that he didn't hate her, that he was afraid. Richard released her wrist as if it burned him. "Get out," he said in a hoarse voice. "Get out of my office, now." Valerie all but ran out, confused, scared, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Richard remained alone, staring at his own birthmark. The same one he'd seen in his dreams, on the wrist of the woman he loved in another life. That night, neither of them could sleep, and when they finally did, they dreamed exactly the same thing, a castle in flames. A promise shouted seconds before death, and 2 crescent moon marks together, covered in blood. If this story is already affecting you, if you feel like there's something here that resonates with something you felt too, let me know in the comments, because this is just beginning. But before we continue, let me tell you something that neither of them knew at that moment, something that science still can't explain. In 2024, researchers at the University of Virginia published a study that changed everything we thought we knew about birthmarks. They studied over 2,000 cases of children who remembered past lives, and they found something astounding. In 63% of the cases, the children had birthmarks that corresponded exactly with fatal wounds from the people they claimed to have been. A boy who remembered dying from a gunshot to the head had a round birthmark exactly where the bullet would have entered. A girl who remembered dying in a fire had marks that looked like burns, in the same areas where her previous body had been damaged. And in the rarest cases, when 2 souls had been connected in past lives, both people had identical marks in the same place, exactly like Richard and Valerie. The crescent moon mark wasn't a biological coincidence. It was a soul signature, a sign that their spirits had chosen to carry through multiple incarnations, an eternal reminder of their promise, a map that would help them find each other when they were finally ready. 1,000 years of searching, etched onto their skin. The following weeks were a silent hell. Richard avoided Valerie with an intensity that bordered on the obsessive. He changed his schedules to avoid crossing paths with her. He requested that she leave his meals at his office door. He locked himself in his room until he heard her go to sleep. But the dreams wouldn't let him escape. They became more vivid, more detailed, more painful. Now he could see specific faces, hear words in a language he didn't know, but somehow understood. He felt the weight of armor on his body, the heat of a desert sun, the smell of incense and blood, and always her, with different names, but always her. In one dream, he called her Isabella. In another, Zara, in another, simply my love, repeated over and over as she wept in his arms. And always, always, the same ending. Death separated them. Richard began to fear sleep. His work began to suffer. The partners noticed the dark circles under his eyes, the increasing irritability, the lack of concentration. An $80 million deal almost fell through because he was staring into space during an important meeting, thinking about a castle he had never visited. That's when Dr. Helena Vasconcelos re-entered his life, or rather, returned to it. Helena had been the best friend of Carla, Richard's wife, who had died of cancer 3 years earlier. They were friends from college, almost sisters, and Helena had been by Richard's side throughout the entire grieving process. She was also one of the most respected hypnotherapists in the country, specializing in trauma, regressions, the deep unconscious. Richard didn't believe in any of it. He considered it quackery. But when Helena visited him one Sunday and saw the state he was in, she didn't give him a choice. "You need help, Richard. And I don't mean sleeping pills." He laughed without humor. "And what are you going to tell me? To lie down on a couch and talk about my childhood? No, I'm going to tell you that your mind is trying to tell you something through these dreams. And if you don't listen, it's going to destroy you." Richard wanted to argue, but he was too tired, too exhausted to fight against something he couldn't see, couldn't touch, couldn't control. "All right," he said finally. "Do what you have to do." Helena smiled in a way that Richard couldn't quite interpret. "Before she died, Carla told me something." Helena spoke softly. "She told me that one day you were going to find your true love, and that you were going to hate her at first." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. "She also told me to trust the dream that night." Richard dreamed of the castle again, but this time, something was different. This time, he could see a date etched in stone above the main door. Year 1025, and he could read the words written below. "Here died the forbidden love between a Christian princess and a Moorish warrior. May their souls find each other in another life." Richard woke up with a start, drenched in sweat. But it wasn't the dream that terrified him. It was what he saw when he turned on the light. His hands were covered in something dark. It looked like dirt. No, it wasn't dirt. It was dust. Ancient dust that smelled of stone and time. And on his wrist, the crescent moon mark was burning. It wasn't physical pain. It was something deeper. As if his soul were remembering a wound that the body had never received. Richard ran to the bathroom. He washed his hands frantically. The dust disappeared down the drain. But the trembling in his fingers didn't stop. He looked at his reflection in the mirror, and for a second, just a second, he saw another face. The face of a younger man, with a beard, with dark eyes full of determination, with a scar that crossed his left eyebrow, the face of Rashid. Richard closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, it was just him, just Richard, the 42-year-old millionaire with chronic insomnia, and a housekeeper he hated for no reason. But something had changed. Something inside him had awakened, and he could no longer ignore it. Richard woke up screaming, because the princess in the engraving had Valerie's face, and the warrior had his. The next morning, Richard did something he had never done before. He looked for Valerie. She was in the kitchen, preparing Luke's breakfast before starting her day. The boy was eating cereal while she wiped his mouth with a napkin, smiling with a love so pure that Richard felt a pang in his chest. He had seen that smile before, in his dreams, in another time, directed at him. Valerie saw him in the doorway, and her smile froze. She instinctively stepped in front of Luke, as if protecting him. Richard realized what he was doing, how she saw him, like a predator, like a threat, and for the first time, He felt shame. "I need to talk to you," he said in a voice softer than he had used in months. Valerie didn't move. Luke looked at her confused, sensing the tension. "Please," Richard added, "it's important." She hesitated. Then she leaned down to Luke and whispered something in his ear. The boy nodded, took his bowl of cereal, and left the kitchen toward the service quarters. Valerie remained standing, arms crossed over her chest, back against the counter, defensive posture, ready to flee or fight. Richard sat down in one of the chairs at the kitchen island. For the first time, he was below her, looking up, vulnerable. "What do you want?" she asked, using the formal "you" he had always demanded. "Your mark," he said. "The one on your wrist. How long have you had it?" Valerie frowned. "Since I was born." "It's a birthmark." Richard nodded slowly. "Me too. Look." He rolled up his shirt sleeve and extended his arm, showing his own mark. Valerie looked at it, and even though she'd seen it that day in the office, seeing it again sent the same chill down her spine. "Identical," she said softly. "I know." "How is that possible?" Richard didn't answer immediately, because the answer he had was impossible, irrational, completely insane. But it was also the only one that made sense. "Do you dream about me?" he asked suddenly. Valerie tensed. Her face became a mask. "Why are you asking me that?" "Because I dream about you. Every night, since the day you arrived." She didn't say anything, but Richard saw something in her eyes. Recognition, fear, and something else. Relief. "In the dreams," he continued, "I love you. I love you with an intensity I've never felt awake. For anyone. Not even for my wife." Valerie opened her mouth to speak, but he stopped her. "And I always die. Or you die. Or we both die. And always, always I promise you that I'll find you in the next life." Tears began to fall down Valerie's cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. "Rashid," she whispered. Richard froze. "What did you say?" "Rashid," she repeated, the tears falling faster. "In my dreams I call you Rashid. And I am. Isabella. And there's a castle. And soldiers. And you're in chains. And I." She collapsed. She fell to her knees on the kitchen floor, sobbing with an intensity that seemed to come from centuries of accumulated pain. Richard stood up so fast that the chair fell behind him. He rushed to her, and for the first time since they met, he hugged her. It wasn't a tentative hug. It wasn't a hug of comfort. It was a hug of recognition. Their bodies fit perfectly, as if they had been designed to be together, as if they had done this 1,000 times before. Because they had. In other lives, in other bodies and with other names, but always them. "I found you," Richard whispered against her hair. 1,000 years. "And I finally found you." Valerie cried harder. Her hands gripped his shirt desperately, as if she were afraid he would disappear. "Why did you hate me?" she managed to ask between sobs. Richard closed his eyes. The answer came from a place he didn't know existed. "Because I was afraid. Afraid of losing you again. If I hated you, I couldn't love you. And if I didn't love you, I couldn't suffer when I lost you." Valerie raised her head and looked at him. Her eyes, red with tears, met his. And in that moment, they both saw, not with the eyes of the body, with the eyes of the soul. They saw the castle of 1025. They saw the dark cell where he was chained. They saw her, dressed as a princess, sneaking down to bring him food. They saw the first kiss, forbidden, dangerous, inevitable. They saw the escape, the night she freed him, the horses galloping under the moon, the promise of a life together in faraway lands. And they saw the end, the soldiers who caught them, the swords that struck him down until he fell, and her kneeling beside him, screaming that she couldn't live without him. The last image they saw was the castle tower, and a figure in white falling from the highest point. When the vision ended, they were both on the kitchen floor, hugging, trembling. "It was real," Valerie said. "It was all real." Richard nodded. He couldn't speak. The emotions were too intense, too ancient, too powerful. "What do we do now?" she asked. Before he could answer, the kitchen door opened. Dr. Helen Hayes was there, and she didn't seem surprised at all. "I saw your car in the parking lot," she said calmly. "I wanted to make sure you were okay. But I see you found what you needed to find." Richard looked at Helen with eyes that were still clouded with tears and glimpses of another life. "You knew. From the beginning." Helen smiled softly. "Carla knew. Before she died, she had dreams too. Dreams where she saw your past and saw your future. She made me promise that when Valerie appeared, I would be there to help you remember." Valerie clung tighter to Richard. "Carla knew about me?" Carla knew that Richard had lived many lives, and in almost all of them, he had died looking for you. She was his rest, his pause. But she always knew that you were his final destiny. Richard closed his eyes. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. That's why she was never jealous. That's why she always told me that true love would find me. That's why she insisted that I bury her and move on. Helen nodded. She loved you enough to let you go to where you always belonged. There was a long silence. Then Richard spoke. "Helen, I need the hypnosis. I need to see everything. I need to understand." Helen looked at Valerie. "You should be there too. What you are going to discover, you will discover together." Valerie hesitated. Then she looked at Richard. And in his eyes, she saw something she had never seen in the 6 months she had been working for him. Love. The same love she saw in her dreams. The same love she had waited 1,000 years to feel again. "Okay," she said. "I'm ready." No one was ready for what they were about to discover. The hypnosis session was scheduled for 3 days later. During those 3 days, everything changed. Richard stopped avoiding Valerie. Instead, he sought her company constantly. They ate together. They talked for hours. They shared the details of their dreams, marveling at how identical they were. Luke, at first confused by the change, adapted with the ease of children. He began to call Richard by his name instead of Mr. Sterling. And Richard, who had never wanted children, surprised himself by teaching Luke how to play chess. But what no one expected was what Valerie found in the attic. She had gone up to look for Christmas decorations that Richard had asked her for. The penthouse attic was huge, full of boxes that no one had touched in years. In one of the oldest boxes, covered in dust, she found something that took her breath away. A diary. Not a modern diary. An old diary. With deteriorating leather covers, yellowed pages, and writing that she couldn't read. But what she could see was the drawing on the first page, a man and a woman. She dressed as a medieval princess, he in clothing that looked Arabic or Moorish. They were embracing, and on their wrists clearly drawn, there were 2 crescent moon marks, and it was them, Richard and Valerie, 1,000 years before. Valerie raced down the stairs. The diary clutched tightly to her chest. She found Richard in his office and showed him what she'd discovered. His reaction wasn't what she expected. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice tense. "In the attic, in an old box." Richard took the diary, his hands trembling. He opened it. He flipped through the pages, looking at the writing he couldn't read, but that somehow felt familiar. And then he reached the last page, where there was a translation, written in modern script, with Carla's signature at the end. Richard read aloud, "Diary of Isabella of Castile, Princess of the Kingdom, in the year of our Lord, 1025, These pages contain the story of my forbidden love, with Rashid ibn Ahmad, a Moorish warrior captured in battle. If anyone reads this in the future, know that our love was real, that we died for it, and that we swore to find each other in every life, until we could be together forever. The crescent moon mark on our wrists is our sign. Look for it, and when you find it, you will know that soulmates exist. Richard stopped reading. He looked at Valerie. Carla found this. She translated it, and she never showed it to me. Because it wasn't the right time, Valerie said softly. You had to find me first. Richard closed the diary. Tomorrow is the hypnosis. We'll see if the diary tells the truth. Valerie took his hand. I already know it tells the truth. I felt it from the first day I saw you. I just didn't know what it was. Richard looked at her. And what was it? She smiled. Coming home. The day of the hypnosis. Arrived with attention. You could cut with a knife. Dr. Helen had prepared one of the rooms in the penthouse, curtains drawn, lights dimmed, soft music playing in the background, 2 reclining chairs, side by side, where Richard and Valerie would sit. Luke was with a nanny, in another apartment in the building. It was better he wasn't present for what was to come. Before starting, Helen explained the process. You will enter a state of deep relaxation. Your conscious mind will take a step back, and your subconscious mind will take control. You may see images, feel emotions, hear voices. Everything you experience, what is real to your mind, even if it happened long ago. And if we see something we don't want to see, Valerie asked. You can't stop once you start, but I'll be here. I'll guide you. And if something becomes too intense, I'll bring you back. Richard looked at Valerie. She looked at him, without words. They both understood the same thing. They had waited 1,000 years for this. They weren't going to back down now. They lay down in the chairs. They closed their eyes. Helen began to speak in a monotone voice, guiding them down, inward, toward the past. Visualize a staircase. Each step takes you further back in time. With each step, you feel lighter, freer. The memories of this life begin to fade, and the memories of other lives begin to emerge. Richard felt his body grow heavy, then light, then non-existent. And then he saw. The first image was the sun, a scorching sun, so intense. He could feel the heat on his skin, sand beneath his feet, the weight of chains on his wrists and ankles, the taste of dried blood on his lips. He was in a cell. No, it wasn't a cell. It was a dungeon. Damp stones, rats in the corners, the distant sound of scream, and he was different. He looked at his hands. They were the hands of a younger man, more muscular, scarred from battle. He wore the remnants of what was once fine clothing, now dirty and torn, and on his left wrist, shining in the torchlight, was the crescent moon mark. My name is Rashid, he whispered, and his voice was different, deeper, with an accent that wasn't his own. Rashid ibn Ahmad, warrior of the Caliphate of Cordoba. I was captured in the Battle of Zamora. Helen intervened gently. What year is it, Rashid? The year is 1024 of the Christian calendar. I have been in this cell for 6 moons. And what happened then? Rashid, who was Richard, closed his eyes. In the memory, within the memory. She came, in the chair next to him. Valerie let out a groan, because she, too, was seeing. It wasn't the cell she saw. It was a castle corridor, lit by torches, filled with shadows. and she walked through it. In a white silk dress, a hood covering her blonde hair, a basket of bread and water in her hands. "I am Isabella," she whispered, in a voice that wasn't hers. "Isabella of Castile, daughter of the Count. And I am about to commit treason." Helen watched, with professional fascination. "Why treason, Isabella?" "Because I am going to help the enemy. The Moor in the cell. Father wants to execute him tomorrow, but I can't allow it." "Why not?" Isabella, who was Valerie, opened her eyes. "In the regression. Because when I first saw him, chained, bleeding, defeated, I felt like I knew him. I felt like we had been together before. And I felt that, if he died, a part of me would die too." The visions continued, now synchronized. Richard, as Rashid, saw the door to his cell open. He saw the figure in white enter. He saw the face of Isabella, illuminated by the torchlight. And he knew, in that moment, in that cell, they both knew. They weren't strangers. Their souls had met before, in lives that neither could consciously remember, but that their bodies, their hearts, their spirits had not forgotten. Rashid rose as quickly as the chains allowed. "You," he said in Arabic, forgetting that she couldn't understand him. But Isabella understood, somehow, beyond logic. She understood every word. She responded, in the same language that she had never studied. "I have come to save you." "Why?" "Because you promised me." Rashid looked at her, confused. "What did I promise you?" Isabella approached. She touched his cheek, and in that touch, they both saw a past life, another era, ancient Egypt, a pharaoh and a slave, the same forbidden love, the same tragic death, and the same promise. "I will find you in every life." Rashid fell to his knees, the chains clanking. "I have searched for you," he whispered. "In every dream, in every battle. I was looking for a face that I didn't know, but that my soul would recognize. And you found it," said Isabella. "I found you." The visions accelerated. Helen guided the regression forward. Through the weeks that followed, Richard and Valerie saw everything. Isabella's nightly visits to the cell, the whispers through the bars, the hands intertwined, despite the chains, the stolen kisses. When the guards weren't looking, they saw the escape plan, the bribes, the stolen keys, the horses hidden deep within the woods. They glimpsed the night of their escape, the full moon, freedom, and they witnessed betrayal. A guard who hadn't been bribed, an alarm that sounded too soon, soldiers on horseback pursuing them relentlessly through the forest. They were overtaken near the river. Rashid fought. He fought with everything he had. He felled 3 soldiers before the swords found their mark. Isabella screamed. She ran to him as he fell, cradling him in her arms, as blood stained the earth. "No, no, no," she repeated, rocking him like a child. "Don't leave me. Not again." Rashid, with his last breath, raised a hand and touched the crescent moon mark on her wrist. "I will find you," he whispered. "Even if you hate me first, my soul will recognize you." And he died. On the sofa, Richard Sterling was weeping, silent tears streaming down his cheeks as he relived his own death. Valerie Sutton was weeping too. But the vision was not over. Helena gently guided. What happened next, Isabella? Isabella, in the regression, held Rashid's body until the soldiers tore her away. They dragged her back to the castle, locked her in her room. Her father bellowed that she was a disgrace, a traitor, a Moor's lover. Rashid's execution had already taken place, but Isabella's punishment was worse. She would be sent to a convent, forever, never to see the sun again, never to love again. But Isabella had another plan. At dawn the next day, she climbed to the highest tower of the castle. She looked down at the courtyard where Rashid had been executed, where his blood still stained the stones, and she jumped. Valerie screamed. On the sofa, her body arched as if she were falling. Helena acted quickly. 3, 2, 1. You're safe. You're here. You're awake. Richard and Valerie's eyes snapped open simultaneously. They looked at each other, and without words, without explanations, without anything but the absolute certainty of 1,000 years of searching, they embraced. They wept together for what seemed like hours, all the pain of that life, all the subsequent lives where they had searched without finding each other, all the times they had been so close, but death had separated them. It all came out in that embrace. Helena left them alone. When they finally pulled apart, Richard cupped Valerie's face in his hands. "I kept my promise," he said. "I found you. I hated you first, like I said I would. But my soul recognized you." Valerie smiled through her tears. 1,000 years, Richard. 1,000 years of waiting. He nodded. And now, for the first time in 1,000 years, we can be together. No princes, no wars, no executions. Valerie frowned. "But there are still differences. You're a millionaire. I'm your housekeeper. The world won't see it differently." Richard let out a laugh that held no humor. The world doesn't understand what we are. The world doesn't know that our souls have waited 10 centuries to reunite. The world can go to hell. Valerie opened her mouth to reply, but before she could, the door burst open. Helena rushed in, phone in hand, her face pale. "Richard, you need to see this. Now." "What is it?" Helena handed him the phone. On the screen was an image, a medieval illumination, a historical document, newly published on the website of a Madrid museum. The title read, "Archaeological Discovery, 11th century manuscript reveals tragic love story between Christian princess and Moorish warrior." And the image of the manuscript showed 2 figures, a man and a woman, with crescent moon marks on their wrists. They were identical to Richard and Valerie. If you've made it this far and don't have goosebumps, reread the last few paragraphs, because what comes next will change everything. The manuscript had been discovered 3 days prior in an archaeological dig near Zamora, Spain. Researchers couldn't believe what they had found, a document nearly 1,000 years old, perfectly preserved in a sealed lead box, written in medieval Latin with annotations in Arabic, and telling a story that no one believed was real. Until now. Richard read the entire article 3 times. The manuscript was written by a monk from the monastery of San Pedro de Arlanza in 1025 AD. According to the document, the monk witnessed a tragedy that shook the entire kingdom. The story was exactly as they had seen in the Hypnosis, a Christian princess who fell in love with a captured Moorish warrior, the failed escape, the execution, the suicide from the tower. But the manuscript had something more, something that neither Richard nor Valerie had seen in their visions. The monk wrote that, before dying, the princess asked him to bury something in the ruins of the castle, something that she and her beloved had created together during their secret nights, a diary, with the promise that, someday, the soulmates would reunite and find the diary as proof that their love was real. Richard looked at Valerie. "The diary in the attic?" Valerie nodded slowly. "Carla didn't find it by chance. She found it because it was destined to be found when we were ready." Helena interjected, "There's more. Look at the next image." Richard swiped the screen and gasped. It was an illustration from the manuscript, a drawing of the two lovers, done by the monk based on descriptions from the time. The man had Richard's face. The woman had Valerie's face. They weren't similar. They weren't alike. They were identical, as if the monk had traveled 1,000 years into the future and drawn them directly. But the most shocking thing was what was drawn on their wrists. 2 crescent moon marks, exactly like the ones that Richard and Valerie had right now. The silence in the room was absolute. Finally, Valerie spoke. "What does this mean, Richard? What do we do with this?" Richard lowered the phone. He looked at the woman he had hated for 6 months, the woman he had loved for 1,000 years, the woman his soul had searched for through countless lives. "It means it's real," he said. "It's all real. Hey, it's not madness, your passion, it's not coincidence. Our souls have been connected for over 1,000 years. And finally, after all that time, we can be together." "But the world," Valerie began. "The world is going to know," Richard interrupted. "The manuscript is historical proof. Researchers are going to want to talk to us when they see that we have the same marks. It's going to be in the news. It's going to be impossible to hide." Valerie turned pale. "Richard, Luke, my son." "I don't want her growing up under that scrutiny." Richard approached her. He took her hands. "Our child," he said softly, "if you'll allow it. Our child. And we're going to protect them. Together." Tears welled up in Valerie's eyes again. You mean it?" "I've waited 1,000 years to say it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I mean it." Valerie gazed at him for a long moment, searching his eyes. And then, for the first time since they'd met, she kissed him. It wasn't a tentative kiss. It wasn't a kiss of exploration. It was a kiss of 1,000 years of accumulated love, a kiss that held all the nights in the castle cell, all the whispers through the bars, all the promises they could never fulfill. When they broke apart, they were both crying and laughing at the same time. Helena watched from the doorway, tears streaming down her own cheeks. "Carla was right," she whispered to herself. "She always was right." The following months were a whirlwind, a blur of activity. But before the world knew their story, there was something else that happened. Something that Richard and Valerie kept private for a long time. 1 week after the hypnosis session, Richard took Valerie to visit the property where his penthouse was built. What she didn't know was that the building had been constructed on the ruins of an ancient colonial structure. And that colonial structure, according to historical records, had been built on something even more ancient. The foundations of an 11th century Spanish castle, the same castle from her visions. Richard had investigated, relentlessly. He had hired archaeologists, he had paid fortunes to access private historical documents, and he had discovered something that left him speechless. The very ground where he lived, where he had met Valerie, where he had hated her and loved her, was exactly the place where Rashid and Isabella had died 1,000 years before. It was no coincidence that Valerie had been hired to work there. It was no coincidence that the diary was in the attic. It was no coincidence that their souls had found each other in that exact place. It was destiny, fulfilling a promise. When Richard told this to Valerie, she wept for hours, but not from sadness, from relief, from joy, from the absolute certainty that everything they had felt, everything they had seen, everything they had experienced, was real. Richard hired a team of archaeologists to excavate beneath the building. What they found changed. Everything science thought it knew about reincarnation, buried 30 feet deep. They found 2 skeletons, a man and a woman, embraced, locked together in a silent, eternal hug, with metal rings on their fingers that had crescent moons engraved on them. Experts dated the bones, 11th century, exactly 1,000 years ago, and when they did DNA testing, they discovered something impossible. The mitochondrial DNA of the 11th century woman had unusual genetic markers, markers that are only found in 1 in 10 million people. Valerie had the exact same markers. It was as if Valerie's body was the same body as Isabella's, 1,000 years later. Science couldn't explain it, couldn't even begin to understand it. But Richard and Valerie didn't need explanations. They knew. Their souls had found a way to return, to reunite, to fulfill the promise they had made while blood spilled and swords flashed. The day they reburied the skeletons with full honors, Rashid and Isabella could finally rest. And Valerie felt, for the first time since she had memory, that a part of her that had always been searching for something had finally found peace. As Richard had predicted, the news of the manuscript went viral, a global sensation. When researchers learned that there was a man and a woman in New York with the same birthmarks as the 11th century lovers, the world went crazy. Journalists, scientists, skeptics, believers. Everyone wanted to talk to them. Richard and Valerie gave only one interview. In it, they told their story. The initial hatred, the dreams, the birthmark, the hypnosis, the diary, everything. When they finished, the interviewer had tears in her eyes. "If this is true," she said, her voice trembling, "it changes everything we know about the soul and about love, about life after death." Richard looked at Valerie. Their eyes locked. "It is true," he said, his voice firm, "and we don't need anyone else to believe it. We know, and that's enough." The interview was viewed by more than 50 million people, a record-breaking number. The comments were divided. Some believed, others doubted, many mocked. But Richard and Valerie didn't care, because they were finally together. 6 months after the hypnosis, they got married. The ceremony was small, intimate, just Helena, Luke, and a few close friends. But there was one detail that no one would forget. Instead of traditional wedding rings, Richard and Valerie exchanged gold bracelets with crescent moons engraved on them. The same symbols that their souls had carried for 1,000 years. Luke, who by then called Richard Dad, was the one who carried the bracelets to the altar. And when the priest declared them husband and wife, something strange happened. A gust of wind blew through the closed windows of the chapel. Everyone felt it, as if someone else was there. Someone who had waited 1,000 years to see that moment. Valerie looked at Richard, her eyes wide. "Did you feel them?" she asked in a hushed voice. Richard nodded, his own eyes filled with tears. It was us, Rashid and Isabella, finally at peace. A year later, their daughter was born. They named her Carla, in honor of the woman who had made everything possible, the woman who had loved Richard enough to let him go to where he always belonged. On the day of the birth, something strange happened. Valerie was in labor when the hospital lights flickered. The doctors thought it was an electrical problem, but Richard knew it was something more, because at that exact moment, he felt Carla's presence. It wasn't his imagination. It wasn't the stress of the moment. It was real as Valerie's hand squeezing his. Carla was there, saying goodbye, blessing the child who would carry her name, passing the torch of love that she had guarded until Richard was ready to receive it. When the baby was born, the doctor placed her in Valerie's arms, and at that moment, the light stopped flickering. Carla's presence faded. But before she left, Richard felt one last sensation, a peace, an approval, a wordless message that said, "You did good. You finally found her." Richard cried for the first time since Carla's funeral, but this time, they were tears of gratitude, because Carla had been the bridge, the rest, the necessary rest, between lives of tragedy, the love that had kept him whole until Valerie could appear. And now, with his task completed, he could finally rest. Some souls come into our lives to stay. Others come only to prepare us for what's to come. Carol had been one of the latter, and Richard would love her for that, forever. And as a middle name, they gave her Isabella, for the princess who jumped from a tower 1,000 years ago, for the love that never died. Luke was rebaptized that same day with an additional name that he himself chose, Rashid. When the priest asked, "Why that name?" Luke looked at Richard with eyes that knew too much for his age and said something that made everyone present cry. Because it's Daddy's name, before he was Daddy. And I want him to know that I remember him, that I always remembered him, that I was there when he and Mommy met the first time at the castle. I was the guard who looked the other way. The silence in the church was absolute. No one had told Luke that story. No one had mentioned the guard at the castle. It was a detail that only Richard and Valerie had seen in their regressions, a detail that confirmed everything. Luke wasn't just a child. He was an old soul who had watched over them for 10 centuries, and finally, he could say it, aloud. Richard embraced his son, tightly, tears streaming uncontrollably. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for bringing her to me, again and again." Luke just smiled, as if he had always known that this moment would come because, as the 5-year-old said, with a wisdom that seemed to come from another era, "I want to be like Daddy, and Daddy was Rashid before." No one argued with him. Richard Sterling died at 89 years old. Valerie was by his side, holding his hand, exactly as Isabella had held Rashid's 1,000 years before. But this time, there were no swords, no soldiers, no tragedy, Hadimau, only peace. "I found you," Richard whispered with his last breath. "I fulfilled my promise." Valerie smiled through her tears. "And this time," she whispered back, "we stayed together." Richard closed his eyes, and when his soul left his body, Valerie felt something that she couldn't explain, a sensation that he hadn't gone far, that he was waiting for her, that, when her time came, she would find him again, as she always had, as she always would, because some souls aren't destined to be separated, only to find each other and again, until the universe finally allows them to stay together. 1,000 years had passed since that night at the castle, 1,000 years of searching, 1,000 years of pain, 1,000 years of promises, whispered at the threshold of death. And finally, after all that time, the promise was fulfilled. "I will find you in every life, even if you hate me at first. My soul will recognize you." And it did. But the story doesn't end there, because after Richard and Valerie passed, something happened. With the investigation of the manuscript, the archaeologists who had excavated the site in Zamora made another discovery, one that they kept secret for years because they couldn't explain it. In the same lead box where they had found the manuscript, there was a sealed letter, a letter that no one had opened in 1,000 years. It was addressed to Richard and Valerie, by name, their exact names, written in medieval Latin 1,000 years ago. The letter read, "To the souls who will find these words when you finally reunite. I am the monk who wrote the manuscript, but there is something that I didn't put in the official document, something that Princess Isabella asked me to keep secret before jumping from the tower. She had a vision, She saw your future lives, all of them. She saw the bodies you would occupy, the names you would have, the places where you would meet. And she saw this moment, the moment when you will read these words. Isabella told me to convey a message to you. Do not be afraid, to love each other completely. This life is different. This time, nothing will separate you. The universe is finally in agreement. And one more thing. Look at your son, the one who is 4 years old, the one you chose to name. With the name of your past, he is not just your son. He is the third soul, the guardian, who has followed you through all the lives, ensuring that you would find each other. In the life of the castle, he was the guard who deliberately looked the other way when Isabella went down to the cell. In other lives, he was the friend who introduced you, the stranger who gave you directions, the chance encounter that put you in the same place at the same time. Luke is not a coincidence. Luke is part of you. He always has been. When Richard and Valerie read that letter, they both cried because Luke had always seemed to know things that he shouldn't know. He had always looked at Richard with a familiarity that made no sense. He had always accepted everything with a calmness that seemed to come from centuries of experience. Luke wasn't just their son. He was their guardian, their protector through time. And finally, after 1,000 years of watching over them from the shadows, he could be part of their family, openly. That night, Richard hugged Luke in a different way. He was no longer just his wife's child. He was no longer just his adopted son. He was the third piece of a puzzle that had taken 10 centuries to complete. And when Luke looked at him and smiled, Richard swore that he saw something in his eyes, an ancient recognition, a mission accomplished, and a peace that only comes when you finally get home. If this story touched you, if you felt something while reading it, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt an inexplicable connection with someone? Have you ever hated someone without knowing why? Have you ever had dreams with people you don't know, but who seem to know you at a tag? Maybe, just maybe, your soul is also searching. And maybe, like Richard and Valerie, like Rashid and Isabella, you too will find the one you've been waiting for. You just have to be willing to recognize them, even if you hate them at first. There is a theory in quantum physics that scientists call entanglement. It says that when two particles become connected, they remain connected forever, no matter the distance, no matter the time. What happens to one instantly affects the other. Scientists in 2024 began to wonder if souls work the same way. If two people can be so deeply connected that, through multiple lives, they keep finding each other, they keep recognizing each other, they keep fulfilling promises that were made in bodies that no longer exist. Richard and Valerie didn't need theories to believe it. They lived it. And every time they glanced at the crescent moon mark on their wrists, they were reminded of the most important truth of all, that true love has no expiration date, that some connections are just too strong to break, and that 1,000 years is nothing when the universe decides two souls are meant to be together. Because sometimes, hate is just fear. Fear of loving so deeply that it hurts. Fear of losing what matters most. Fear that this time, like all the other times, it won't be enough. But Richard Sterling learned something in his 89 years of life, and it's this. The love that's worth finding is the one that makes you tremble with fear, and the love that lasts 1,000 years is the one you're willing to search for, again and again, until you can finally stay. 1,000 years, 40 generations, countless lives, a promise, and finally, a happy ending. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you believe in soulmates, if you believe that love can transcend time, share this with someone who needs to hear it, because somewhere, right now, there are two people who hate each other without knowing why. And maybe, just maybe, this story will help them understand and that hate is just the beginning, and love, true love, is forever.